binary-options.com here, and we are continuing our Binary Options Academy projects, still on the part with how to trade a specific currency pair. So far we've covered the Euro-US dollar, we've covered the US dollar and Japanese yen and so on, and this was related to the Great Britain pound US dollar or the cable pair. And now we're going to discuss how to trade the US dollar and Canadian dollar, or in plain English, what to consider from a fundamental point of view as important economic releases when you look at the US dollar and Canadian dollar. So, like any currency pair, the US dollar and Canadian dollar is being driven, or it is moving based on the economic differences that are happening in the United States and of course in Canada. In Canada. So far we've discussed what were the main things to consider in UK on the Great Britain pound US dollar. First of all, the first thing to consider, or the main things to consider when you are looking at the US dollar and Canadian dollar, is to understand what's happening there. The Canadian dollar is also being called the loonie pair. So the Canadian dollar is being called loonie. Now this loonie, so when you hear, I don't know, when you read an economic release or an article and it says that loonie is bullish or loonie is bearish, you gotta know that it is referring to the Canadian dollar. Or the loonie pair, it is the US dollar and Canadian dollar. If we said that in the United States the Federal Reserve of the United States is the central bank, in Canada it is being called the Bank of Canada. Bank of Canada. If the Fed is meeting every 6 weeks, the same is happening with Bank of Canada, sometimes even earlier depending on a holiday. And while the Fed has the FOMC statement, the Bank of Canada has also the statement. It is a statement followed by a press conference. Now here you gotta note the difference. The difference is that while in the United States a press conference is coming every 2 or sometimes even 3 meetings, in Canada a press conference follows each and every interest rate decision. Nowadays or lately, press conferences are even more important than the actual interest rate decision, because these central banks are announcing all these kind of unconventional measures that have the tendency to bring even more volatility into market than a classical interest rate hike or interest rate cut. Imagine, for example, the Fed is coming to hike the rates, but it may hike the rates. The initial reaction would be high on the US dollar, but then at the press conference 30 minutes later, the actual tone of the speech will be dovish, and then the US dollar will be hurt. It may be that it comes with a hike and then with downgraded projections on the GDP or on the economy, or the dots or the staff projections, and that will trigger a US dollar sell-off despite the actual increase. What you gotta know, or what you gotta remember when you trade any Canadian dollar pair, is that Canadian dollar moves based on what the oil market is doing. So it is strongly influenced by oil. Not equal, not 100% correlation, but you gotta know news that are happening with oil. What are the news that are to be released that involves oil? Well, oil inventories, when they are being released, the API inventories, or any news that influence the Brent and the oil market, oil inventories. OPEC meetings, you know the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC meetings. Why these OPEC meetings are important? These OPEC meetings are important because the members are discussing levels of production, if production is increasing or decreasing, and the oil market is being driven by the old natural law of supply and demand. So if production increases, then of course it will be more oil on the market, so price is going to move lower. If price is going to move lower, because oil and Canadian dollar are directly correlated, then the Canadian dollar is going to move lower as well. So the US dollar Canadian dollar most likely will move higher on such a news. Stay tuned for the second part to find out what else is important for the US dollar and Canadian dollar pair.